He walked out of a small-town hospital and disappeared, less than 3 kilometers from safety. No cameras recorded his final steps. No witnesses saw where he went, and no search team went looking that night. For 7 years, his family would cross oceans in search of answers, only to discover that the truth had been waiting, heartbreakingly close, all along. Before we begin, let me know where you're joining from tonight. Your voice matters in stories like this. Share it in the comments. And if you value real cases told with respect, consider subscribing. This is the story of Owen Rooney, a 24-year-old Australian backpacker whose journey to Canada was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, until it became one of the country's most haunting unsolved disappearances. In the summer of 2010, Owen Rooney arrived in British Columbia, Canada, full of plans and possibility. He'd worked hard back home in New South Wales, saving money to fund a working holiday. His visa allowed him to take seasonal hospitality jobs, explore the wilderness, and experience life on the other side of the world. Friends described him as warm and grounded, a young man who made friends easily and kept close contact with home. To his parents, Sharon and Steve Rooney, he was independent but careful, responsible, capable, and the last person anyone would imagine could simply vanish. That August, Owen joined thousands of travellers at the Shambhala Music Festival, held near Salmo, British Columbia. For 5 days, the mountains came alive with light, sound, and celebration. Along the riverbanks, festival-goers danced beneath the stars, their laughter echoing through the trees. Witnesses would later recall that Owen seemed exhausted and a little disoriented toward the end of the festival, perhaps dehydrated or overwhelmed, but still coherent and friendly. He planned to rest, then return to work in Kelowna, where his job and friends awaited him. On August the 8th, he sent his final message home. "Doing fine, heading back soon." At the time, it felt like just another check-in, but in hindsight, it became the last trace of his voice. In the days that followed, Owen's path grew uncertain. There were no confirmed sightings, phone calls, or bank transactions. What began as a carefree trip through the mountains dissolved into silence. By August 14th, he had somehow travelled hundreds of kilometres off course, eastward toward Christina Lake, a quiet lakeside community near the US border. Locals later described the area as dense and isolated, a maze of pine forest and gravel backroads. That evening, residents of a rural property on Chase Road called the police. A man matching Owen's description had approached their home, asking for help, appearing confused and agitated. When asked to leave, he reportedly returned moments later, trying to enter the property again. Believing he was an intruder, the homeowners restrained him, admitting later that they struck him several times in what they claimed was self-defense. When RCMP officers arrived, they found Owen on the ground, bleeding from the head, disoriented and frightened. There was no smell of alcohol, no sign of drugs. He spoke in fragments, unable to explain what had happened. Police noted the visible injuries and decided to transport him about 20 minutes west to Boundary Hospital in Grand Forks for medical evaluation. Inside Boundary Hospital, Owen was admitted for observation of a head injury. Staff recorded that he appeared alert but confused, coherent one moment, detached the next. He repeated himself, lost focus mid-sentence, and at times seemed emotionally unsettled. Nurses documented bruising on his face and head, yet no CT scan or neurological exam was ever performed. No blood test, no imaging, no formal medical evaluation to rule out concussion or internal bleeding. During his stay, Owen made a statement that would later haunt investigators. He told a nurse, "A police officer hit me." That remark was informally noted, but never officially reported or investigated, despite hospital policy requiring immediate notification of any alleged assault involving police. Instead, staff concluded that he was mildly confused, possibly exhausted or under the influence, though no evidence supported that assumption. Over the next few hours, Owen's condition appeared stable. He was given a meal, allowed to rest, and checked periodically. He was 24 years old, concussed, vulnerable, and thousands of kilometers from home. By early evening, nurses described him as calm but restless. Around 8:30 p.m., he was seen sitting quietly on a picnic bench outside the hospital's main entrance, bruised, barefoot, and deep in thought. No one thought to stop him. At Boundary, patients often stepped outside for air. That quiet moment, the image of a young man alone beneath the fading summer light, became the last confirmed sighting of Owen Rooney, alive. Sometime after 9 p.m, a nurse returned to check on him. Owen's bed was empty. His hospital gown lay neatly folded on the side table, and beside it, a pair of borrowed clothes. On the nearby chair sat everything he owned: his backpack, wallet, passport, phone, even his ID cards, all untouched. It looked as though he had stepped outside for a few minutes, intending to return, but Owen never came back. The nurse informed the on-call physician, who in turn contacted the RCMP. The report was calm, procedural. Patient left voluntarily. No alarm was raised. No emergency search began. For hospital staff, it wasn't unusual for young patients to leave against medical advice. For police, it was just another case of an adult choosing to walk away. In the records, Owen was classified as a voluntary departure. That single assumption, that he had left of his own will, would define the next 7 years. RCMP officers checked the nearby streets, but conducted no perimeter search. No tracking dogs were called in. No local alert was issued. By the time darkness covered Grand Forks, the trail was already fading. Inside the hospital, Owen's belongings were sealed for safekeeping. One staff member later recalled assuming he would come back the next morning to collect them. When he didn't, the tone began to change, but slowly. It would take nearly 24 hours for his absence to be escalated to a missing person report. That single day, lost to hesitation and paperwork, became the gap through which all hope began to slip. Back home in New South Wales, his family had no idea what was happening. They expected photos, updates, maybe a call to say he'd returned to work. Instead, the next message they received would shatter their world. When police finally reached them, the details were vague. Owen had walked out of a hospital and disappeared. He wasn't in trouble, they said. He wasn't under arrest. He had simply left. For Sharon and Steve Rooney, those words made no sense. Their son had suffered a head injury. He was alone, injured, barefoot, and without identification in a foreign country. And yet, no one was searching for him. There were no cameras at Boundary Hospital in 2010. No footage to show which direction he went. Beyond the hospital grounds, open fields stretched toward dense forest, unlit and silent. Had someone searched that night? Had anyone checked beyond the parking lot? They might have found him within minutes. But no one did. As the paperwork settled, Owen Rooney ceased to exist as a patient and became a statistic. Voluntary departure. In reality, he was a confused young man wandering into the night, unseen, unprotected, and unheard. Somewhere beyond the glow of the hospital lights, Owen stepped barefoot into the dark, away from help, away from safety, and into a mystery that no one would chase until it was already too late. For days, the town of Grand Forks carried on as if nothing had happened. Few people even knew a man was missing. To those who did, it was just a story whispered in passing, another traveller who'd wandered off. But 13,000 kilometres away, in the rolling hills of New South Wales, Australia, a mother's world was collapsing. When Sharon and Steve Rooney received the call from Canadian authorities, their first reaction was disbelief. Owen? Missing? It had to be a mistake. He was level-headed, grounded, and dependable. He'd survived cross-country trips, lived abroad, and never once vanished without word. But as the days passed, disbelief turned to dread. The calls from police became less frequent. Updates were vague. no new leads emerged. And for the Rooneys, distance turned every unanswered question into agony. Within a week, Sharon, Steve, and Owen's two sisters, Bree and Kelly, boarded a flight to Canada. They arrived in Grand Forks to find a community kind but confused. Local officers walked them through the hospital grounds, retracing the steps Owen had likely taken that final night. They were shown the bench where he'd last been seen, the small hill where the forest began. Beyond that, endless trees swallowed the view. When Sharon asked how far the search had gone, the answer stunned her. Police had checked nearby roads, a few trails, and neighbouring properties, but there had been no coordinated ground search. The assumption that Owen had left voluntarily had limited the investigation from the start. Because he was an adult, not a child or a declared medical emergency, there was no legal trigger for a full-scale search. "We just thought he'd turn up," one officer later said. For the Rooneys, that answer was unbearable. Their son had a known head injury, no shoes, no phone, and no identification, and yet authorities treated his disappearance as a choice. Taking matters into their own hands, the Rooney family began organizing volunteer searches. Locals, hikers, and even strangers who'd heard the story joined in. They combed the hills behind Boundary Hospital, tracing game trails and riverbanks, leaving orange flags to mark the areas they'd covered. But each day ended the same. Nothing. Helicopters were eventually brought in by the family at their own expense. They searched the ridgelines, creek beds, and forest clearings from above. Still, there was no sign, no clothing, no tracks, no trace of a man who should have been within walking distance of town. The family's efforts caught the attention of the Australian media. Back home, the story of the missing Aussie backpacker became national news. Viewers watched as the Rooneys pleaded for help from halfway across the world, hoping someone, somewhere, had seen their son. Owen's case was added to international missing persons databases. His photograph, smiling, tan, and healthy, circulated across Canada. But as weeks turned to months, the leads grew cold. Behind the scenes, the investigation faltered. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, had limited manpower in Grand Forks, a small detachment responsible for a wide area. Records later revealed inconsistencies, missing notes, delayed follow-ups, and unclear timelines. One crucial document, the hospital's internal incident report, was never forwarded to the family. It noted Owen's confusion, his statement about police, and his medical condition. Yet none of it was shared. When the Rooneys requested updates, they were told little had changed. Searches had been completed, interviews conducted, and the case remained open but inactive. What they didn't know was that by late 2010, the RCMP had quietly downgraded Owen's file from active missing to no immediate leads. In effect, it was on hold. Every few months, Sharon sent emails to Canadian authorities. Most went unanswered. She began compiling her own database, maps, statements, even weather reports from the night he vanished. She learned that the temperature had dropped to near freezing after sunset. With a head injury and no shoes, Owen would have been at risk of hypothermia within hours. She also learned that the area behind the hospital, where search teams had focused briefly, was far larger than anyone had realized. Hundreds of acres of rugged terrain and old mining cuts, places easy to miss without detailed mapping. In one interview years later, Sharon's voice trembled as she recalled those months. "We thought we'd find him. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was news. Even bad news would have been better than none. By the second year, life had split in two, the life they lived and the one they imagined Owen might still be living somewhere. Rumours surfaced of possible sightings. A man matching his description in Vancouver, another in Alberta, one more in the Yukon. Each tip sent the Rooneys on another emotional climb, only to fall again when the leads proved false. Steve, a carpenter by trade, focused on logistics, maps, phone calls, paperwork. Sharon became the emotional anchor, speaking publicly, keeping Owen's name alive. His sisters handled the online side, managing a Facebook page that drew thousands of supporters. But as time went on, the energy waned. The RCMP's tone grew more detached. In 2012, one officer summarized their stance bluntly. "There's no evidence of foul play. He likely succumbed to the elements." To the Rooneys, that wasn't an answer. It was an excuse. Why had the hospital released him without medical clearance? Why had no one contacted the family the moment he disappeared? And if he had died nearby, how could 7 years of searches find nothing? The contradictions multiplied. The official story said Owen left voluntarily. Yet everything he owned, money, passport, identification, was left behind. Even stranger, police notes revealed that the area around the hospital had been searched by volunteers multiple times in 2010, though not by trained recovery teams. Had the search been properly coordinated, the truth might have surfaced much sooner. For the Rooneys, these failures became unbearable reminders of how institutions can lose sight of individuals, how procedure, paperwork, and indifference can erase urgency. By 2014, the case had largely disappeared from Canadian headlines. Only small anniversaries and family-led campaigns kept it visible. Each August, Sharon posted a photo of Owen on social media with the same caption, "Still searching, still waiting, still hoping." The family visited Grand Forks twice more in the following years. Each trip felt heavier. The mountains that once seemed vast and promising now felt suffocating, haunted by silence. Locals remembered the orange flags from the early searches, still fluttering in the wind. To them, Owen's name became a kind of echo, something spoken quietly in cafes or mentioned when newcomers asked about the missing Australian. But for his family, it was more than a local mystery. It was a life suspended in time. Then, in September 2016, everything changed. A group of hikers exploring a wooded ridge less than 3 kilometers north of Boundary Hospital stumbled upon what appeared to be human remains. Nearby were fragments of clothing and personal items weathered by years of exposure. Police were called immediately. The area was sealed off, and forensic teams from the BC Coroner's Service arrived to recover what little could be found. Within weeks, dental records confirmed what the Rooneys had both feared and expected. The remains belonged to Owen Kieran Rooney. 7 years after he vanished, the boy who'd once travelled across the world had finally been found, within sight of the very hospital that had last cared for him. For the Rooney family, the news brought both relief and devastation. Sharon later described the moment she received the call. "I was grateful to finally know, but it broke me all over again, to think he was so close all this time." The irony was unbearable. They had searched mountains, rivers, and entire provinces, only to learn that Owen had been right there, hidden in the forest above town. Local residents joined in quiet memorials. The hillside where he was found became a place of reflection, a reminder of how easily someone can disappear in plain sight. But as the family soon discovered, even discovery would not bring full closure. The questions remained, sharper than ever. How did a young man with a clear head injury leave a hospital unnoticed? Why was no proper search launched that night? And what truly happened in those final hours between the bench and the forest line? The answers, when they came, would be as incomplete as the story itself. Because even in death, Owen Rooney's case refused to fit neatly into explanation. The summer light over British Columbia can be deceiving. It softens even the harshest landscapes. The pine forests shimmer gold, the rivers glow silver, and the mountains breathe a quiet that feels almost protective. But in 2016, that silence was broken. It began with a pair of hikers, tracing an old mining trail above Grand Forks, an area that had long been forgotten by search teams. The air was still, the soil dry and sun-cracked. They noticed what looked like tattered fabric tangled beneath a fallen log. At first they thought it was an old camping tarp. Then something metallic, a zipper, a fragment of bone. Within hours, police were on scene. Forensic specialists arrived from the BC Coroner's Service, carefully marking the perimeter of a shallow depression in the earth. Among the scattered remains were the faded traces of clothing, fragments of footwear, and the quiet persistence of time. The coordinates placed the site less than 3 kilometers from Boundary Hospital, directly uphill, within sight of the building that had been Owen's last known location 7 years earlier. The confirmation. The identification process was meticulous. DNA samples were taken, dental records cross-checked against the ones provided by Owen's family years before. Days turned into weeks, and the Rooneys waited in Australia, knowing deep down what the outcome would be. On a quiet September morning, the phone rang. The remains were confirmed as Owen Kieran Rooney. The news carried both the weight of finality and the sting of betrayal. For 7 years, they had scoured the breadth of Canada, only to learn he had never left. The place that was meant to heal him had been the last to see him alive, and the nearest to where he died. When Sharon Rooney spoke publicly days later, her words were measured, trembling, yet unmistakably resolute. "We're grateful he's been found, but it's hard knowing how close he was all this time." The search was over. The questions were not. The BC Coroner's Service released its findings months later. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. The skeletal analysis revealed 2 fractures, one to the sternum, another to a rib, injuries consistent with blunt force trauma near the time of death. But with advanced decomposition, it was impossible to tell whether those wounds had come from a fall, an accident, or something darker. There were no signs of animal interference, no evidence of drowning, and no environmental cause strong enough to explain why a healthy young man had perished so close to safety. The coroner's report did not assign blame, it simply closed the file. No weapon was found, no new evidence emerged, and the RCMP declared there was no indication of foul play. The case, they said, was over. For the Rooneys, it was the final insult, a bureaucratic ending to a human tragedy. As the dust settled, journalists and advocates began to look deeper. What they found was not a mystery solved, but a pattern exposed, a web of small decisions and missed opportunities that together sealed Owen's fate. At Boundary Hospital, nurses had noted Owen's confusion and visible injuries. He'd told one of them, "A police officer hit me." Yet that statement, by all accounts, was never documented formally or forwarded to investigators. Hospital protocol required immediate reporting of such allegations. It never happened. No CT scan was ordered, no neurological imaging performed, no formal psychiatric evaluation took place. Instead, staff believed he was suffering from mild disorientation or exhaustion, perhaps due to substance use, though no tests confirmed that theory. Hours later, he was gone. When he left the hospital grounds, no one stopped him. No one called police until long after he'd vanished. And even then, the response was tepid. He was listed as a voluntary departure, not a missing person in distress. Had the search begun that night, he might have been found within minutes. Instead, it took 7 years. The more the Rooneys learned, the more the contradictions deepened. In the months after the discovery, Sharon revisited the case files, combing through every note and timeline. What she saw was a pattern, not of malice, but of indifference. Each institution had done just enough to absolve itself, but never enough to save him. The hospital treated him as a free adult, not a patient at risk. The police treated him as a voluntary wanderer, not a missing man with a head injury. And the coroner, years later, treated his death as a statistic. No one ever connected those dots in time. "He fell through the cracks," Sharon said in an interview with ABC Australia. Except those cracks were wide enough for a person to disappear. It was a truth that cut across more than just their family. In Canada, dozens of missing person cases had followed a similar pattern. adults with injuries, mental health struggles, or confusion who walked away from care and were never seen again. Owen's story became a quiet example of how compassion can vanish in the shadow of protocol. In 2017, the Rooney family brought Owen home. His ashes rested in a small urn, carried across the same ocean he had once crossed, with excitement and hope. At the memorial in New South Wales, sunlight filtered through eucalyptus trees as his mother whispered the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "We found you, love. We're taking you home." There was peace in that moment, but not forgiveness. Because beneath the grief lay an enduring question. How could this have happened in a system built to protect the vulnerable? To this day, the RCMP stands by its conclusion: no foul play, no wrongdoing, case closed. Boundary Hospital has since updated some of its patient oversight policies, though officials have never publicly acknowledged failure. The coroner's findings remain on file, a summary without resolution. But among those who followed the story, the unease lingers. Even the geography tells a cruel story. The hill where Owen was found overlooks the hospital's rooftop, the same place he sat moments before disappearing. From that vantage, the building stands visible through the trees, so close you could almost call out to it. It's a haunting symmetry. A man dies within sight of the institution meant to save him. Owen Rooney's death did not lead to public outrage or sweeping reforms. It faded quietly into the archives of Canadian tragedy, remembered mostly by those who searched, grieved, or investigated. But among those who've studied the case, it remains a symbol of something larger: the fragility of institutional trust, the way small oversights can snowball into irreversible loss, and the human cost of systems that choose procedure over empathy. One Canadian journalist later summarized it best: Owen didn't vanish into the wilderness. He vanished into paperwork. That line would echo for years. In classrooms, investigative reports, and true crime documentaries that tried to understand how a man could die so near salvation. In her final interview, Sharon Rooney didn't speak of blame or revenge. She spoke of recognition. "I don't want anyone punished," she said softly. "I just want someone to say, 'We failed him.' That's all." But that acknowledgement never came. The system closed ranks, the files were sealed, and the story settled into the uneasy space between closure and injustice. Still, for those who knew Owen, there was solace in knowing he was no longer lost. The hillside where he was found is quiet now, dotted with wildflowers and the faint remnants of old search markers, their orange ribbons faded by sun and time. Locals say that on clear days, when the wind moves through the pines, it almost sounds like whispering. Perhaps it's just the forest, or perhaps it's a story that refuses to be forgotten. In the years since Owen's discovery, his name has appeared on missing person advocacy pages across both Canada and Australia. His story is now taught in social work and forensic nursing programs as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when communication breaks down, when compassion gives way to complacency. There's no monument on Hardy Mountain, no plaque or marker, only the trees and the faint outline of a life interrupted. But for those who followed his journey, Owen's legacy is not in the mystery, but in the message it leaves behind: that no one should disappear in plain sight, that every missing person deserves urgency, not assumption, and that the distance between care and neglect can sometimes be just 3 kilometers wide. As the camera fades to black, the final words linger, not as an ending, but a quiet call to conscience. He was just a boy who needed help, and nobody stayed long enough to see that. Owen Rooney's case stands as a quiet reminder of how a simple system failure can change everything. A young man walked out of a hospital, and for 7 years, no one could explain why it took so long to find him, just 3 kilometers away. His story isn't only about loss. It's about awareness, accountability, and the need to truly see those who need help the most. If you found this case meaningful, take a moment to like this video and share it so more people can learn what really happened. Your support helps us bring real cases like this to light, told with truth, care, and respect. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Blacklight Investigation for more in-depth stories that deserve to be remembered. Because behind every case like Owen's, there's a truth still waiting to be found.